chapter 2. I'd like just to read a few words from there. In Mark chapter 2, Mark writes, "And when he, Jesus, returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. And many were gathered together so that there was no more room, not even at the door. And he was preaching the word to them. And they came, bringing to him a paralytic carried by 4 men. And when they could not get near him because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him. And when they had made an opening, they let down the bed on which the paralytic lay. And when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, 'Son, your sins are forgiven.'" Pretty amazing, isn't it? For some of you, you have been attending church for a while. Maybe as long as you can remember. That's my story. I sometimes joke my mom gave birth to me on a church pew. She didn't, but... So you've been around and you've been attending church for a long time, but maybe some of you are here today and you're kind of new to this whole church attendance, being committed to church thing. So my question I want to ask is being part of a church what you hoped it would be? And if not, how have your experiences been different from your expectations? I was just recently reading about a man who had nearly abandoned his faith. He had a terrible series of health and emotional problems. And he said this: "During my darkest hour, God stayed silent. Prayer did nothing for me." And he said at the end, when he finally came out of the valley in this life, he said, "You know what kept me from chucking the whole thing?" He said, "It would mean having to go to 3 or 4 people I respect more than anyone else in the world and tell them, 'You were deceived.' I couldn't bring myself to deny the reality of God's Spirit in their lives." Now, there was another person who was listening to him tell this story, and he kind of popped up and said, "That's exactly why I'm tempted to abandon my faith. Frankly, I don't see the reality of God's Spirit in people's lives. I want some direct evidence of God." My wife, when she was in high school, worked for this franchise some of you have heard about called McDonald's. And if you were a teenager in the early 80s, that was a sweet gig, because it meant, among other things, you were going to be able to get discounts on the most healthy food in America, McDonald's. But she found out something after working there for just a while that maybe some of you have experienced in restaurant world. She found that she had, after a while, a very low tolerance for Big Macs, filet of fish, quarter pounder French fries. I won't do that commercial anymore, but some of you remember that. After a while, she did not like McDonald's food anymore. You know, it's a strange thing for a lot of us who have become committed to attending and serving in God's church. One of the reasons we got into church was the idea that we could work with God and for God. Whatever else it might or might not do, at least we hope that being part of a church would grant us some sort of automatic spiritual maturity. But the sad truth is that being involved in church can often make us more desensitized to God in his movement in our life. Because people see the visible stuff. I get together with you once, twice, maybe 3 times a week. We gather, and I can hold out on what's really going inside deep in my heart. I can garner up a, "Hi, I'm doing fine, how are you?" Or if I'm really brave, I might ask you to pray for me because this week I'm going to have some tough stuff I'm facing and I'm a bit stressed. But whether or not I truly am engaged in a life of prayer, whether or not I'm opening my heart to God, whether or not I'm arranging my life so that I am loving people, or whether or not I'm struggling with anger or envy or being competitive or anxious. Most people don't see those things because I keep them down just beneath the surface. So what I'd like us to look at today is to see what it can look like to be part of doing life together, community, and getting in the trenches with each other, truly loving each other. So I want you to imagine with me as best you can what life was like for this paralyzed man. Imagine he was a close friend of yours or someone from your family. This man's whole life was lived on a mat that was 4 feet wide and 6 feet long. Somebody else had to feed him. Someone else had to carry him and clothe him. People had to move him every so often so he wouldn't develop bed sores. Someone had to clean him when he soiled himself. The sense of independence that you and I can take for granted, this man would never know. Medically, there was nothing that could be do for him that would solve his issues. There were no surgeries or rehab or treatment centers, no way for him to contribute to society. Back in this day, anyone in this man's condition would have to go through life as a beggar. They would have to be laid by the side of the road and be dependent on other people's charity to survive. But this man could dream. And sometimes in his dreams, he would dream of having a healthy body. Sometimes he would be able to walk and run and do good work. Maybe even he was married in his dreams and could play with his children. But then he'd wake up and look up at a ceiling of a room that he would never walk out of. He'd look down at the body that had held him as a prisoner. He'd look at that mat that was his world and realize that he would never be free. He had no money, no job, no influence, really no future. What does this guy have going for him? Well, he has friends, amazing friends. He has a band of brothers. And in one sense, this whole story takes place because this band of brothers, they're his friends, and they want him to get to Jesus. They're wondering, maybe this Jesus, what they're saying is true. Maybe he might be able to be healed. The stories are circulating around about things that Jesus has done. Now, you have to know that the development of these friendships for that man didn't just happen. They weren't accidents. This little community was purposeful. See, again, back in Jesus' day, if you had this kind of physical condition, the deck was stacked fully against you. And it was also real likely that you wouldn't have friends. You know, even as advanced as we are in our day, and working with people that have physical disabilities, we still know that this can be a very unfriendly place for them. People aren't real patient with them because we have a faster moving environment, and people cannot be gracious at times because they want these people to move and pick up to their pace. One of the countless things that stands out about Jesus is not just that he has a power that he does, but it's his attitude that naturally drew people, especially like this paralytic, to himself. He was like a magnet that drew people who were hurting in all sorts of ways, physically, emotionally, and really most importantly, spiritually. Now, the ancient world was no friendly place for disabled people. If you read back in history, there were horror stories, especially among the Greeks, who regularly disposed, that's the word, of newborn infants who had physical defects. They just got rid of them. The Greek philosopher Aristotle once wrote this: "Let there be a law that no deformed child shall be raised." Rome in the 5th century actually had a law on the books that gave people the right to quickly kill a deformed child. Now, in Israel, this man would have suffered under a different stigma. There was a common assumption that if someone had a physical deformity, that they had to have something in their life they did that caused them to receive this infirmity or to be born with it. Remember in John 9, Jesus' disciples walked by a person who's paralyzed and say, "Well, Jesus, who was it that sinned? Was it him or his parents?" Just the assumption someone had to cause this, and Jesus says, "Neither." The thinking was that if someone was suffering, there was some sort of divine payback for their doing wrong. And some people sadly believe that today. But in today's story, we have this little group of people that refuse to let their friend's physical condition or some social shame keep them from being and doing life together. This paralyzed man must have wrestled with his full dependence on his friends, and sometimes he may have even been jealous of their independence and their strength. It's a very vulnerable thing to have somebody else carry your mat. When somebody's carrying your mat, they see you in your weakness. If someone is carrying your mat, they're going to hurt you if they drop you. But this little band of brothers values each other so deeply. They serve each other and are served by each other. And they give each other the priceless gifts of trusting vulnerability and dependable faithfulness. And friends, that's what biblical community looks like. So at the beginning today, I want to ask you a few questions to ponder as we go throughout this study. Number one is, who do you let carry your mat for you sometimes? Because it's real important to understand that we all have our own mats. Who do you show your weaknesses and strengths to? Who do you ask to hold you up in prayer? Who do you allow to see your brokenness? Because if you never choose to be vulnerable, you choose to never really enter into community. You can't do this all at once. You obviously shouldn't walk up to someone after the service today and say, "Hey, my name's Mike. Let me just tell you that I have a gambling addiction. Would you pray for me? And can I borrow $20?" Those kind of relationships take time, don't they? To truly build authenticity. And I realized over the years, 30 plus years of being a pastor, that God was calling for me to model what it looked like to be open and appropriately vulnerable, to let people see my mat sometimes. And you need to know that pastors, you know they have clay feet, you know they're not perfect, but they don't have it all together and they don't have all the answers. Now, it didn't used to be a challenge for me. When I was younger in ministry, I just trusted most everyone. I wasn't the kind of person who met you the first time and shared with you my worst secrets, but I trusted people. I would let my guard down. I would, in the pulpit sometimes, appropriately talk about maybe difficult times I was going through. And sometimes that backfired on me. Sometimes real quickly, other times down the road. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not talking about people who use the pulpit as their therapy couch and just start telling you everything. Never forget, in the first church where I was a senior pastor, I was as vague as you could be, but in some part of the sermon I said, "I've had a really rough week." And that was about as deep as I got. And I went on. And there was a man after the service in the foyer. He pulled me aside. He said, "Mike, you talked about today having a rough week." And there's something in my heart going, oh man, he's gonna follow through. He's gonna maybe ask me how I'm doing and how he can pray for me. And he said to me in so many words, you can't do that. You see, we need you to be strong for us. And my heart sank, and my gut got a really weird feeling in it. But here's the catch, friends. If you want to experience meaningful friendships, you can't hide all your deep secrets, and you can't always be the strong one. You have to let somebody else carry your mat sometimes. And that's what happens here. These friends have a relationship that it requires impressive character. Against all odds, this is a little, if I can use the Fellowship of the Ring, Lord of the Rings, a fellowship of the mat. Putnam Baptist Church needs to be full of people who have friendships like this. Putnam needs to be a safe place where people can reveal their vulnerability without worrying that one day you're going to keep that in your back pocket and bring it out and say, yeah, well, you were this way. So Mark tells us that one day Jesus came to Capernaum, and these four guys found out Jesus was in town, and naturally they wanted to hear him, and one of them had a thought. We can't just go ourselves, we have to bring our friend. This could really help him. I don't even think they were hoping first and foremost for healing. They just wanted him to hear this Jesus, and they had logistical issues though. Because how are they going to get him to Jesus? Well, first, they have to pick him up and carry him. And when they say to him, we're going to be at your house at 9 o'clock, and we're going to pick you up at 9, they literally meant we're going to pick you up at 9 o'clock. And when they took him from his home or wherever he was, they took him to the home where Jesus was teaching. And Mark tells us that room was packed. Standing room only. He even throws in verse 2, there was not even room at the door. So you can't even have the door open and stand outside and see Jesus. Can you imagine their frustration? They are so close to getting their friend to Jesus. Now, this was before the important verse was written in the Bible that's so important in the American church. That verse that says, thou shalt place a church bulletin, or even thy Bible, or a pillow to reserve thy seat, and anyone who sitteth thereupon shall be cast into utter darkness. I remember, I've never had that happen to me, but I've had people just walk up to them their first Sunday and say, you're in my spot. By the way, welcome to our church. They hadn't counted on this crowd. They were shut out. So they're just thinking, the wheels of their brains are turning, and one of them, who's kind of an outside-the-box thinker, says, I know how we can get him in there. Hear me out. Let's make a hole through the roof and lower him in from the ceiling. And maybe the leader of this group says, okay, are there any other ideas? But there were no other ideas. The hole in the roof option was it for them. But they're so desperate to get their friend to Jesus, and they're not going to let anything stand in their way. So strong is their trust in Jesus. So great is their love for their friend. Now, architecturally, it was common in those days in the ancient Middle East for houses to have a little staircase on the outside that led up to the roof, and people would use it as kind of a patio. So they go up there and begin remodeling this man's home for him. Can you imagine the scene? Jesus is teaching, and suddenly everyone looks up, and there is a hole in the roof, and there's 4 pairs of hands up there rooting around and making the hole bigger. What if you were the guy who agreed to have everyone come to your house? This wasn't what you had planned. Now they're putting a skylight in for you. So this guy calls Allstate, talks to his agent to see if he was covered, Jesus was here, so maybe it's considered an act of God. But in those days, the roofs consisted of wooden cross beams, and they would have the rest put together of a mixture of mud and straw. So it was different than our day. It would be easier to dig a hole open and to repair it later. But how's Jesus going to respond to this? Because teachers don't like being interrupted, because it can distract them, it can break their concentration. You have to be up here, as I've been for many, many years, to see all of the different distractions. I've preached in front of 5,000 people. I will tell you the truth. I am much more nervous preaching in front of a small crowd. The smaller the crowd, the more nervous I am. The larger the crowd, I just look out and see colors as best a colorblind guy can. Doesn't make me nervous. It's when I started preaching in smaller churches because I can see that person over here sleeping. And there's something that happens in people when anyone gets up in the middle of a sermon and begins to move. You think they just rubberneck on the road when they're driving? It's like no one has seen a person get up and move. Every head. What are they doing? So I want you to get the picture. The crowd has gathered in this man's house, and they see 4 faces staring at Jesus, faces of friends who have nothing to ask for themselves. Their only thought is getting their friend closer to Jesus. Because that's what friends do for each other. They want primarily to draw each other to Jesus. Look at verse 5. A fascinating phrase here. And when Jesus saw their faith. This is very unique in the New Testament. Usually we hear about the faith of the person asking to be healed, or maybe a family member or a parent if it's a child. But here is the faith not primarily of the man, but of his friends. Do you have any idea what the faith of one person can do for a friend? It moves these folks to dig a hole through a roof. Let me ask you another question. When is the last time you dug a hole through a roof for a friend? When's the last time you engaged in an unusual act of service for someone else's being? I was reading not long ago a definition of families that I think applies to the church, and it communicates deeply love. I think that should be part of every healthy church. And here was the definition. It said a family is a group that has developed and implemented an irrational commitment to the well-being of its members. It's that word irrational that's so striking to me. Because as this friend, a member of this community, they were devoted to him, not because he did something for them, not because this man was useful to them, but because they were devoted to him. Our society, and friends, even many of our churches, have confused the word friends with friendly people. Let me give you an example. You go on an airplane. I was, for instance, a few years back on an airplane back from Oklahoma I had seen my dad who was ailing. And the stewards or stewardesses were very attentive, asking me, would you like a pillow? What would you like to drink? Is there anything else I can do for you? Now, the problem would be this, is when the plane lands, I say to one of the attendants, you've been such a good friend to me during this flight. Oh, thank you, sir. And would you mind giving me a ride back home to Traveler's Rest? I don't want to have to wait for my wife or my kids. I would love to sleep in the back of the car while you drove the rental car to my house. Would you do that? Because that's what friends are for. And the problem is, yeah, I'm your friend, or I am friendly. It's part of my job. But no, not giving you a ride home. There's a difference between being a friendly person and being a friend. We live in a world of networking and contacts and looking back and forth on social media, and sometimes it can be you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And when you can't get anything out of a relationship anymore, once the plane lands, the relationship is over. Now, that may be someone you work with, and you have a mutually beneficial relationship. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but that's not a friend. And I get concerned with this in churches, because sometimes churches get confused between being friendly people in order to be more effective at keeping people coming back to their church, or being people that are friendly to newcomers, especially if you find out that they have a pretty impressive job, which means I start doing my figuring on their tithe. Ooh, that would be nice. This person that's new could be someone that could help us get more stuff done. You look at someone new and say, thank the Lord. We're so tired of carrying this ourselves. We need a fresh body. Get in here. Now, my background is I grew up attending only large churches. And both of the churches I served in as an associate pastor were large churches. So I had little to no experience of small churches until God called me to pastor my first church in January of 1997 in Northeast Florida to a massive group of 50 people. That was counting cats and dogs as well. Now, here's my thought. I just kind of figured that the smaller the church, the friendlier the church. Because when you walk into a large church, I remember walking up to people at the church in Michigan, and I would shake their hand and say, hey, are you new? No, son, I voted on you 5 years ago. Oh, okay. Been here since the beginning. Sorry. I'd be at a restaurant or at a supermarket. Hey, Pastor Mike. Hi. I don't know who they are, but I thought, well, in small churches, everyone knows when someone walks in that back door, everyone knows that that's a new person, and guess what? That person immediately knows you know they're new. This is great, I thought. But I watched really in shock in this church as new people would walk into that church and no one, and I mean no one, would even greet them. One Sunday, very early on, I was doing what's important to do every once in a while, take a shower. Sunday morning, and I was having a sneezing fit. And when I sneezed, I bent over, and those big sneezes that scare children and stuff like that. Sneeze, 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 and then one time I sneezed, and guess what I couldn't do? Stand back up. And I'm brand new. I have no associate pastor or anyone that can fill in. So I walked to church like this, and I told the people kind of what happened. They were very nice. And I had a chair I sat in, and I preached. In through the back door comes a woman and her little child, brand new. No one's greeting her. After the service, she's not milling around much, but she's kind of slowly going out, not rushing. No one's greeting her. So I went down the aisle as fast as I could. I came out to her car. I said, my name's Michael, thank you so much. And she just laughed like, you didn't have to do that. I thought, oh, yes, I did. And thankfully, she brought her husband to church, who became a Christian later. But that always was a joke with us. You were bent over on the way. That was really quite a greeting from you. Now, I learned over time that some, listen to me very carefully, not all, some churches are small for a reason. Some churches are small because there's not a lot of people in their community. But after 4 years in Florida, God led my wife and I to a church closer to where I grew up, just outside of Washington, D.C., about 45 minutes in Maryland. This was a church of about 200 people. And I was told this church needs to be revitalized. But the difference between the Florida church is they knew that they were actually a revitalization project. And this church, everything looked fine to them because they had lots of money in the bank. They sat on 10 beautiful acres. Incredible curb appeal. And they set off of a main road that people traveled a ton. And there were churches right around them that were larger. They didn't have a church split. I was their third pastor. But my first Sunday there was their 25th anniversary. I didn't think a lot of it. We had a banner that said the name of the church, 25 years of God's amazing grace. It was in the foyer. And over time, I would have visitors come in, and one person said to me, "How come you're 25 years old and you're this size?" Well, I had no horror story of a big split or the last pastor went out guns a-blazing, no. But over time, I realized there were reasons why this church never grew. And I noticed a pattern. I would see people come into our church. They would visit, and this church was the exact opposite of my Florida church. When someone walked into that foyer, my worry is more that they were going to swarm to death. These people were so friendly. And never did I have to walk up and introduce myself to someone. They brought new people. "Hey, Pastor Mike, this is so-and-so. They just came from Rockville. They're looking for a church." They were just amazing that way. So a pattern emerged. We had this thing where I would call the person that was visiting that first time. I called them during the week, said, "Hey, just want to thank you for coming." We had a series of letters we would send out to them. There was a first week visiting letter, a second week that was a little bit different. Third week was like, "Hey, we'd love for you now to start coming to our Sunday school. I teach a membership class that's in always a rotation." And it wasn't a 3-hour membership class with goodies at the end. This was a full 12-week class because it was important that people knew what we believed about the Bible because they weren't familiar with our denomination. And so I would teach through doctrine. And it was important because by the time that person said, "I want to become a member," I knew them very well. And the leaders of the church didn't have any questions about their salvation. But I would watch as these new people would come in. They would become a member. They would become part of Sunday school in a small group. They would serve. This was all different ages, young couples, singles, older families. And then after about 2 years, they would just start leaving. So I began to think, how can I find out what's going on? So I did a series over time of exit interviews. And I made it real clear. I'd like to talk to you. I'm not going to sell you anything. It seems that you're leaving. Can you just tell me, can we sit down and talk and find out why? Now, these sometimes were people that didn't know each other. They came and left before somebody else came and left. But I began to hear patterns. And one person put it perfectly well. The phrase they used, they said, "You know what? I feel like if we're going to use terms of dating, that this church dated me hard, married me quick, and then I was forgotten." And they weren't leaving because of a lack of attention from people or because of my preaching. What they experienced was they could only get so far, and they knew they'd never become part of the inner circle. It was never told to them it's off limits, but it was there. And the people that stayed were the people that the inner circle, maybe they thought, hey, they got some money, they got some influence. They felt, these people, that at the end of the day, they were just tools to be used so that the shop ran well. Friends, that was a church that didn't know how to carry each other's mats. Because everyone has a mat. Everyone is worth breaking through a roof for. So, when's the last time you dug through a roof? When's the last time you really listened to someone and what they were going through? Now, there's what's called active listening, where when someone's talking to you, you're like, oh, okay, yeah. You're not looking anywhere else. But I can be an overactive listener. Yeah. You want to finish a sentence for them, and I'll see it in my wife's face. Let me finish the sentence. When's the last time you listened to someone who needed you even though you were in a hurry? Have you ever had someone hurry up and listen to you? When's the last time you spoke the truth to someone that you loved dearly because you wanted them to grow and it took great courage in your life? When's the last time you thought of a way to enter into someone's life who was struggling? Maybe saying, hey, let's get together once a week and have coffee and let's struggle together. Let's have some content with our struggle, as I call it. Let's read a book and we'll read it separately, get together and talk about it. Just informal ways just to enter into each other's lives. Back to our story. These friends dug a hole through a roof and they lowered him down. Notice there's no record of them saying one thing in this story. It's not what Jesus heard that moved him. Notice that verse 5 says it's what he saw. What did he see? Their faith. Jesus saw a big hole in the ceiling with 4 faces in it, sweaty, dusty, hopeful faces, trusting that somehow Jesus would respond to their friend. Jesus saw a little bit, I believe, of what God intended when he made us as humans. This is humanity at its finest here, friends. This is community. And Jesus turned and looked down at that twisted, motionless body on a mat, and he didn't just see a broken body. Oh, no. He saw, like every one of us, that we were broken on the inside, a fallen soul. And he speaks so tenderly to this man in verse 5. What does he say to him? Son, your sins are forgiven. Thanks, Jesus, but I got problems with my sins. This man who had been mocked and judged by people, who assumed that his damaged body was an indication that he was spiritually inferior to them, this man is being told by Jesus, you're totally forgiven. Don't miss this, friends. Jesus is fulfilling the desire of this man's friends, maybe even deeper than they realize, because when somebody is your friend, your greatest desire for them, greater than their external well-being or physical health, the greatest desire is that things are right between them and God. And if someone is truly my friend, their deepest desire is for my character, my soul, because I was designed by God. We're designed by God to be mat carriers and roof crushers. And I love another interesting part of this story in verse 6. Another group of people were there. The religious leaders, teachers of the law. I don't know that they brought any friends to Jesus. They were supposed to be the most spiritual ones. They were the ones that people came to ask theological questions. But let me ask you this. Who were the greater group of people in God's eyes? Those friends. These impolite roof crashers. There's a place in Massachusetts, a museum on Nantucket Island called, to this day, the Life-Saving Museum. And there is a story of a life-saving society originally called the Humane Society that was started in the 1600s by volunteers. See, on that coast, there were these huge storms, and a lot of people died in those storms right off of the coast of Nantucket. But because it was a heavy shipping community, the community said, let's band together, volunteers, and they built what were called huts of refuge. They marked the shore, and they would be for people to be able to see day and night. And anytime a ship went down, the world would go out. These folks would go out, and they were paid nothing as volunteers to do this. They would risk their lives to save people they had never met. And here was their motto, quote, "You have to go out, but you don't have to come back." How's that for a catchy recruiting slogan? But people went out by the hundreds. An interesting thing happened when the Coast Guard became a thing. Because the attitude that society formed was then, let's let the professionals do it. So they stopped watching the coast, and they stopped going out. Now, what's fascinating is to this day, that society still exists, and they have dinners occasionally in Boston, and they give out awards for community service. It's just that they're not in the life-saving business anymore. That can happen in church, can it? That can happen in a Sunday school class. The church is still going. It still has its programs and services. We're just not in the life-saving business anymore. And I think that most of us grew up in church, came to church, served in church because something happened a long time ago that confirmed our belief that there was nothing else we'd rather do than see people come to Christ and draw closer to Jesus. And then there are people over time, maybe real spiritual people in our eyes, maybe like those of us maybe who have grown up in church a long time, and we become people that just aren't into the life-saving business anymore. So look at your text at Mark 2, verse 8. And this is scary if you're in the room with Jesus, because what he could do next kind of blows you away. And immediately Jesus, perceiving in his spirit that they just questioned within themselves. How'd you like that one? Jesus says to them, "Why do you question these things in your hearts?" You might see anything about questioning him? Oh yeah, you were thinking it. Verse 9, which is easier, to say to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, or to say, rise, take up your bed and walk? Then Jesus says in verses 10 and 11, but that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He says, I'm going to prove I'm not just blowing smoke here. Jesus turns to the paralyzed man and says in verse 11, rise, pick up your bed, and go home. And there was just this dead silence. And everybody is staring at the man. And this man has been paralyzed probably his whole life. It's not that he's just paralyzed, but his muscles have atrophied. They become very weak. So Jesus doesn't just cure his paralysis, he throws in some muscle tone as well. And the man stands up, lifts his mat off of the ground. Think of it. He spent his whole life on this 4x6 mat, and now his feet can carry him as far as he can go. He has been healed, but more importantly, his heart has been made whole. Every sin has been forgiven. Physically, spiritually, he's the healthiest guy in the room. And look at verse 12. And he rose and immediately picked up his bed and went out before them all, so that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, we never saw anything like this. I bet. What the spiritual leaders do? He got us here. I've known that guy since he was a baby. Man, something about you. I need to check into this. No. Their hearts just hardened against him. So let me close by asking you three important questions. Number one, what is your mat? If there were one place you could come before Jesus this morning and say, Lord, this is where I need you to touch me. Here is where I need to be made whole. Maybe it's a secret you've been carrying for so long and it's weighing you down. Maybe there's a pocket of guilt that no one else knows about in your life. Maybe something is going on in your marriage or family that's kind of breaking your heart. Maybe you have dreams that just aren't coming true and it doesn't seem like they're going to. I don't know what your story is today, friends, but I do know this much. Everybody has a mat. What is yours? 2. Who do you let carry your mat sometimes? Anyone? And last, are we building at Putnam Baptist Church little fellowships, little bands of brothers and sisters? Are we still in the life-saving business? Let's pray. Dear God, again, as it is every week, a sermon where I can point one finger at my brothers and sisters here and 3 are pointing back to me. Because it's so easy to just do this church thing. Come in, say hi to each other, sing some songs, hear the choir, hear some announcements, hear a sermon, go home, and not really be changed at all. It's so easy for us, because I'm pretty sure that although there are a lot of even Baptist churches in Union County, if every person who didn't know the Lord or didn't attend a church came to Christ and attended church, we'd have to build more and more churches. We wouldn't be able to fit them all. We would be like that room, packed, even the door. Father, every one of us have a circle of influence, and some of us know people that gave up on church a long time ago, and their story we may think, well, yeah, okay, there's hypocrites there, and we kind of brush it off, but really, God, they're aching, and they need to know that they can be loved by people who are just honest, broken, mat carriers, and roof crashers. God, I pray for this church. I pray for me that you would move in our life, that we would not only see a revival in ourselves, but that revival would just catch like wildfire throughout this community. And people will hear from many of us, just like the Samaritan woman, come to this place and hear about this God who knows me, and God is healing me, and it's not perfect, but oh, he's so good, and we love you, and we just want you to come as you are. We want to go out to that community, God. Sometimes it's only come and see. We need to go and tell. Help us, God, to live out the great commandment and the great commission at Putnam Baptist Church. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.